The poor rancher risked his life for two Apache sisters. Their chief's decision changed his fate forever. Blood on his hands wasn't unusual for Boon Carter. What was unusual was that it wasn't his own. He stood over the massive mountain lion, its golden eyes now empty, staring at nothing. The beast's claws were still warm, still wet, but the two Apache women behind him weren't running. They weren't screaming. They were just watching him like they had been expecting this exact moment. Boone's shirt hung in tatters, 3 deep gashes across his chest bleeding freely. His makeshift spear, just a broken fence post with a rusted nail, lay bent and useless beside the dead predator. Any reasonable person would have run. Any smart person would have hidden. But Boon Carter had done something that made no sense at all. He had fought a mountain lion with his bare hands and won. The older sister stepped forward, her dark eyes studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She said something in Apache to her younger sister, who nodded slowly. Then she looked at Boone and spoke 4 words that would turn his entire world upside down. The prophecy is true. What prophecy? Boone had never heard of any prophecy. He'd never even spoken to an Apache before today. But somehow these women acted like they knew exactly who he was, like this whole thing, the attack, his intervention, even the location, had been planned. The younger sister knelt by the dead lion. She didn't flinch from the blood. Instead, she reached into the animal's mouth, her movements precise, practiced. She pulled out something small, something white. It was a piece of carved bone, stained with the beast's blood. She held it up to the light, and Boone saw strange markings etched into its surface. Symbols he didn't recognize, a language from another world. "It was inside the cat," she said in perfect English, her voice carrying an impossible certainty. It was carrying a message, but that was impossible. Mountain lions didn't carry messages. Wild animals didn't deliver carved bones with mysterious symbols. Yet here it was, evidence that everything Boone thought he understood about this day, about his life, was wrong. The older sister touched his wounded chest, her fingers tracing the claw marks with careful precision. 3 cuts, she murmured, her voice filled with awe, just as the seer foretold. A seer? A prophecy? A message inside a wild animal? Boone suddenly felt like he'd stumbled into something much larger than a simple animal attack, something that had been set in motion long before he'd ever heard the screams echoing across his barren land. He was no longer just a poor rancher. He was a piece in a puzzle he didn't understand, and he had a terrifying feeling that the game had already begun. Boone's legs trembled as the adrenaline faded, leaving only a searing fire across his chest. The 3 claw marks ran from his left shoulder down to his ribs, deep enough to need stitching, deep enough to leave scars for a lifetime. Blood soaked through his torn shirt, dripping onto the dry, cracked earth. "We need to stop that bleeding," the older sister said, her voice snapping him out of his shock. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had tended countless wounds. "I am Ayana. This is my sister, Nayeli." Nayeli held the carved bone up to the light again, turning it slowly in her fingers. The symbols seemed to shift in the failing light, telling a story he couldn't read. "Someone carved this. It's a warning." "A warning about what?" Boone managed to ask, his throat dry. "We don't know yet," Ayana said, pulling a leather pouch from her belt. She began taking out strips of clean cloth and a small jar of pungent salve. "You saved our lives. We were gathering medicinal plants when she attacked. You didn't have to risk yourself for strangers." Boone winced as she began cleaning his wounds. The pain was sharp, but it was a grounding force in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. "Couldn't just stand there and watch," he muttered. "Most would have," Ayana replied, her eyes meeting his. "That's why our chief values men like you." "Your chief doesn't know me," Boone said, the confusion returning. How could any of this be happening? The sisters exchanged a look, a silent conversation passing between them in an instant. Naeli pocketed the carved bone and moved closer. He knows about you, Boon Carter. Word travels fast. The man trying to make something of the cursed land to the south. How did they know his name? How did they know where he lived? Boon had been a ghost for 3 years, a solitary figure struggling against the drought, barely keeping his few cattle alive. He rarely spoke to anyone, let alone the Apache, whose lands bordered his own. The drought hit everyone hard, Ayanna explained as she worked, her hands gentle but firm. Your neighbors gave up and left. They sold their land for pennies. But you stayed. You kept working land that everyone said was worthless. Naeli nodded, her gaze sharp. Chief Takakota respects persistence. He respects a man who doesn't break. What would your chief want with a failed rancher? Boon asked. The question was a raw wound, the sum of 3 years of back-breaking labor and heartbreaking disappointment. Ayanna finished bandaging his chest, tying the knots with expert precision. She stepped back, her eyes holding a strange light. Who says you failed? Before Boon could respond, before he could even process that question, Naeli pointed toward the horizon. Her body went tense. Someone's coming. In the distance, a small group of riders appeared, dark shapes against the blood-red sunset. Even from this far away, Boon could see they rode in a tight formation, disciplined, purposeful. As they drew closer, he counted 6 men on horseback. Their leather clothing and long flowing hair identified them as Apache. That will be our brother and his men, Ayanna said calmly, but her hand rested near a knife on her belt. They were tracking the same cat. Boone's stomach tightened into a cold knot. He had just killed a mountain lion on what was likely Apache hunting grounds. He was a white man, covered in blood, standing with 2 of their women. For all he knew, he hadn't just saved 2 lives. He had started a war. Will there be trouble? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Naeli looked at him, and for the first time since the attack, a small, unsettling smile touched her lips. That depends, she said, on whether the prophecy chose correctly. The lead rider dismounted with a fluid grace, his boots hitting the ground without a sound. He was tall, broader than Boon, with shoulders that spoke of immense strength. Scars crisscrossed his arms, old stories of battles won, but it was his eyes that commanded attention, sharp, intelligent, and currently burning holes into Boon. Ayanna, Naeli. His voice was low, a rumble of thunder that carried both relief and authority. We heard screams. This man saved us, Itankan, Ayanna said, using a title of respect. The cat had Naeli cornered against the rocks. He killed it. The man they called Itankan didn't look at Boon. His eyes were fixed on the dead mountain lion. He circled it slowly, examining the wounds, the blood spatter, the claw marks in the dirt that told the story of a desperate, brutal fight. 3 deep punctures in the cat's neck showed where Boon's makeshift spear had found its mark. You killed this alone? Itankan finally asked, his gaze snapping to Boon, cold and hard. Yes, Boon replied, forcing himself to meet the man's gaze. With what weapon? Boon gestured to the bent fence post lying uselessly in the dirt. That, and my hands when it broke. One of the other riders spat on the ground, muttering something in Apache. Itankan silenced him with a single sharp gesture. Show me your hands, he commanded. It was not a request. Boon extended his arms. His knuckles were split and swollen, his palms torn raw from the rough wood. Deep scratches covered his forearms where the cat's claws had raked across his skin. Itankan examined the wounds without a word, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at the dead animal again. Mountain lions do not attack in daylight, he said, his voice flat. Not unless they are starving or rabid or protecting their den. Naeli stepped forward, pulling the carved bone from her pocket. We found this. It was inside her. Itankan took the bone. As his fingers traced the strange symbols, his face darkened. A flicker of something, fear, anger, recognition, flashed in his eyes. He closed his hand around the bone, concealing it from view. "These markings," he growled. "They are not Apache." "Then who?" Ayana asked, her voice laced with dread. "The cattlemen," Itankan said, his voice like grinding stone. "The ones from the east. This is their mark. The mark of the Baxter gang." Boone felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. He knew of the Baxters. Everyone did. They were ruthless land grabbers who saw Apache territory as nothing more than an obstacle to be cleared. They used intimidation, violence, and worse. "The cat wasn't hunting," Itankan continued, his eyes now fixed on Boone with a new, terrifying intensity. "She was driven here. Someone drove her from her den toward our women carrying this message." He held up the bone. "They wanted to create an incident, an excuse to bring in the soldiers." The pieces began to fall into place, forming a picture more sinister than Boone could have imagined. The Baxters weren't just pushing boundaries, they were trying to start a fire. "You said the chief knows about me," Boone said carefully, his mind racing. "What exactly does he know?" Itankan studied him for a long, heavy moment. "He knows you've refused 3 offers from the Baxter gang to sell your land. He knows you've shared water from your well with Apache families during the drought, even when your own cattle were dying." Boone was stunned. He'd never thought anyone noticed. "He also knows," Itankan continued, taking a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "that your land sits atop the only hidden spring in this entire region, a spring the Baxters would kill for. And he knows that the prophecy says a man with 3 scars will be the one to either save us or destroy us." Itankan's hand tightened on the hilt of his knife. "The only question is, Boon Carter, which one are you?" Boone's heart hammered against his ribs. A hidden spring? A prophecy? This was no longer about a chance encounter. He was standing at the center of a storm, and Itankan's hand was on his knife, his eyes filled with a century of suspicion and pain. "I'm just a rancher," Boone said, his voice strained. "I didn't ask for any of this." "The prophecy does not ask," Itankan replied coldly. "It chooses." He looked from Boone's bandaged chest to the dead lion, then to his sisters. "The Baxters are moving faster than we thought. Forcing this beast upon you was not a random act. It was a test." "A test for who?" "For you," Ayana said softly, stepping between Boone and her brother. "And for us, to see what we would do." "Our chief sent us to watch your land," Nayeli corrected, her eyes never leaving her brother's tense frame. "To protect it. He was deciding what to do about you." "Do about me?" Boone was just one man, barely surviving. What could a powerful chief possibly want with him? Itankan seemed to come to a decision. He let go of his knife and straightened up. "Chief Takakota has been watching you for months. He saw your decency, your refusal to break. But decency is not enough to fight men like the Baxters. He needed to know if you had the courage of a warrior. Today," he conceded with a slight nod, "you gave him his answer." The group began to move. 2 of the riders brought forward spare horses for Ayana and Nayeli. But instead of riding away, they all waited, their dark eyes fixed on Boone. "Are you coming?" Itankan asked. "Where?" "To meet the chief. He has been waiting to speak with you." The way he said it implied the waiting had been going on for a long, long time. Boone looked back in the direction of his small, failing ranch. His whole life was in that dusty patch of land. Then he looked at the dead mountain lion, the carved bone that represented a threat he was only just beginning to understand, and the fierce warrior standing before him. The prophecy, the hidden spring. It was all too much. "What if I say no?" Itankan's expression grew hard as granite. Then you ride back to your ranch alone. You will have to face the Baxters alone, and the prophecy will find another way to be fulfilled, likely over your dead body. The choice wasn't a choice at all. It was a current, pulling him into a deeper, more dangerous river than he had ever known. Chief Takakota wanted to meet the man from the prophecy. The question was whether that meeting would be a welcome or an execution. His fate, it seemed, was no longer his own. Boon mounted the spare horse they offered, wincing as the movement pulled at the fresh wounds on his chest. The animal was strong and well-trained, a stark contrast to his own bony nags. As they rode away from the bloody scene, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving his old life behind, a skin he had shed on the desert floor. The Apache settlement lay nestled in a valley protected by towering redstone formations that rose like ancient fortress walls. Boon had passed near this area countless times, but had never seen any sign of it. The entrance was a narrow, winding canyon, completely invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. It was a hidden world. "How long have your people lived here?" Boon asked Diana as they descended into the valley. "Since my grandfather's time," she replied, her voice filled with pride. "He chose this place because it has everything we need: water, shelter, and most importantly, protection from those who would drive us away." The settlement was larger than he expected, with nearly 30 dwellings. It was a mixture of traditional wickiups and more permanent log and adobe structures, showing a community that had adapted and endured. Children played in the central plaza, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. Women worked together, tanning hides and grinding corn. Men tended to a large herd of healthy horses in a corral at the far end of the valley. What struck Boon most was the air of purposeful activity, of life. This wasn't a temporary camp. It was a thriving town, a community that had learned to blend tradition with the hard realities of survival. His own ranch, with its silence and solitude, felt like a grave in comparison. "Chief Takakota is waiting by the council fire," Itankan said, pointing toward a large, circular area where smoke rose in a steady column toward the darkening sky. As they approached, Boon saw an older man seated on a simple wooden chair, his weathered hands folded in his lap. Chief Takakota appeared to be in his late 60s, with silver-streaked hair tied back with a leather cord. His face was a map of his life, lined with wisdom and sorrow, but his eyes were sharp and missed nothing. He wore practical leather pants and a simple cotton shirt, but a beaded vest marked his position of authority. "Welcome, Boon Carter," the chief said in clear, unaccented English as Boon dismounted. His voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable power. "Please, sit." Boon took the offered seat across the fire from the chief, acutely aware that the entire village had gone quiet. Dozens of tribal members had gathered at a respectful distance, their faces silhouetted by the firelight. They were all here to watch, to judge. "My daughters tell me you fought a mountain lion with your hands to save them," Chief Takakota began, his eyes fixed on Boon's. "I used a fence post first," Boon clarified, feeling the need to be precise. "My hands were a last resort." The chief nodded slowly. "Honesty, it is a good quality." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, what do you know about the men who want your land?" "Only that they've made 3 offers. When I refused the last time, their man said they wouldn't ask again. He said next time, they would take it." "Do you know why they want that particular piece of land?" the chief asked, his gaze unwavering. Boon shook his head. "It's worthless. Too dry, too rocky. I've barely kept a dozen head of cattle alive." Chief Takakota's eyes seemed to bore right through him. "Land is never worthless, Mr. Carter. You have been living on top of the Anpituwi Spring, the Morning Sun Spring. It is a place my people have held sacred for generations, and it is the only source of water for 20 miles that has not been touched by the drought." The confession hit Boon like a physical blow. A sacred spring. He had been living on holy ground without even knowing it. Your land is not an obstacle to the Baxters, the chief continued, his voice low and grave. It is the key. With that spring, they can raise 1,000 head of cattle. They can control this entire territory, and they can drive my people into the desert to die. The chief stood and walked to the fire. He picked up a burning stick and drew a map in the dirt at their feet. He drew the Baxter holdings to the east. He drew arrows pushing west toward the valley, and then he drew a small square directly in the path of those arrows, right over the hidden spring. "This is you," he said, tapping the square with the stick. "The cork in the bottle." "What happens if I stay and fight?" Boon asked, his voice hoarse. "They will crush you," the chief replied without hesitation. "One man against their money and their guns stands no chance." The crowd murmured in agreement. This wasn't just a conversation, it was a verdict. "But," Chief Takakota continued, his voice rising, "one man fighting alongside his brothers, that changes everything." The implication hung in the air, thick and heavy like the smoke from the fire. Boon realized that everything, the attack, the rescue, the prophecy, this very meeting, had been leading to this single pivotal moment. He was being weighed, measured, and tested in front of the entire tribe. His answer would not just decide his own fate, but the fate of everyone watching. Chief Takakota erased the lines in the dirt with his boot and returned to his chair. The gathered tribal members moved closer, forming a tight, silent circle around the council fire. The air crackled with anticipation. This was a formal proceeding, and Boon was at its center. "For 3 months I have watched you," the chief began, his voice carrying to every person present. "I saw you share your well water when your own cattle were dying of thirst. I saw you repair the fence that keeps our horses from wandering onto your land, a fence your neighbors tore down out of spite. You have shown respect for our boundaries and our ways, even when you received nothing in return." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Men and women nodded. Boon hadn't realized so many of his small, lonely actions had been observed and recorded in the tribe's collective memory. "Today," the chief's voice grew stronger, "you risked your life for my daughters. You did not hesitate. You did not think of reward. You fought a mountain lion with nothing but courage and a broken piece of wood. The seer spoke of a man with 3 scars who would come in a time of great need, a man who would carry the heart of a protector." He stood again and walked to a large wooden chest beside his chair. From it, he withdrew a worn leather document case. "These cattlemen who threaten you also threaten us. They want to drive us from this valley, take our water, and force us onto the reservation, where we will be dependent on government rations that arrive spoiled, if they arrive at all." He opened the case and removed several official-looking papers, their seals catching the firelight. "But I have something they do not expect, a secret weapon. This is a legal title to this land, granted by the territorial government 15 years ago in exchange for our service as scouts during the wars. This valley is legally ours." Boon stared at the documents. Legal land ownership by an Apache tribe was almost unheard of. It was a shield, but a fragile one. "The Baxters assume we are squatters who can be removed at will," Chief Takakota explained. "They are wrong, but a piece of paper means nothing if we cannot defend what is ours." He put the documents away. "Your land, and the sacred spring beneath it, is the linchpin. Without it, their expansion is crippled." "What are you proposing?" Boon asked, though he already knew the answer. "An alliance," the chief declared, his voice ringing with authority. "A pact. You continue to work your ranch, but you do it under our protection. In exchange, you fight with us. You teach us the white man's ways of fighting, his tactics, his deceptions, while we teach you ours." The offer was more than Boon had ever dared to hope for, but he knew it came at a price. "What kind of help?" Chief Takakota gestured to Itankan, who stepped forward holding a brand-new rifle. a model far superior to Boone's own worn-out repeater. "You can shoot?" the chief asked. "Yes, but the Baxters will have hired guns, killers who care nothing for the law." "We need a warrior who understands both worlds," the chief said, "someone who can stand between them." Boone looked at the faces in the firelight. These people were offering him something he hadn't had in years: belonging, purpose, a reason to fight. But they were asking him to kill, and perhaps to die, to defend it. "There is something else," Chief Takakota continued, his expression turning grim. "Something that makes this alliance necessary now." He nodded to Naeli, who stepped forward, holding the carved bone. "We sent riders to investigate the markings on this bone," she said, her young voice steady and clear. "What they found changes everything." Itankan spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "The Baxters aren't just marking territory. They're building a fort 10 miles east of here, an armed compound, a supply depot. They are bringing in dozens of men. This isn't about cattle anymore." The implications hit Boone with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a land dispute. It was an invasion. "How long?" Boone asked. 2 weeks, the chief replied. "Maybe 3. They are waiting for more men from Texas. And they are waiting for a piece of paper from a corrupt judge that they think will give them the authority to wipe us out." The weight of the decision settled on Boone's shoulders. Accept the alliance, and he was committing himself to a war. Refuse, and he would face the Baxters alone, while these good people lost everything. "If I agree," he said slowly, "what would be expected of me?" A rare smile touched Chief Takakota's lips. "First, you would move your cattle here, to our protected valley, where they will have clean water and rich grass. Second, you will help us prepare our defenses. And third," the chief's expression grew deadly serious, "you will stand with us when the fighting starts. Not as a hired gun, not as an outsider, but as family. Family." The word echoed in the silent valley. Before Boone could give his answer, the sound of a horse galloping at full speed shattered the night. A young rider burst into the council circle, his horse lathered with sweat, his face tight with urgency. "Chief!" the rider cried, dismounting before his horse had even stopped. "The Baxters! They're at Boon Carter's ranch! At least a dozen men, heavily armed. They're setting fires!" The time for decision was over. The war had already begun, and Boone's choice would have to be made not with words around a fire, but with blood and bullets in the dark. Boone didn't hesitate. He rose from his chair, the firelight casting a long, determined shadow behind him. "I accept your alliance," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. "But we need to move now." Chief Takakota nodded, his eyes gleaming with approval. "Itankan, gather 20 of our best warriors. We ride immediately. Boone, you will guide us. You know the fastest route." The peaceful valley exploded into a whirlwind of controlled, purposeful action. Warriors emerged from their dwellings, not with bows and arrows, but with rifles and bandoliers of ammunition. Horses were saddled with practiced efficiency. Women began gathering medical supplies, their faces grim but resolved. This was a scene they had prepared for, a nightmare they had long expected. Ayana approached Boone, pressing a heavy, well-oiled rifle into his hands. It was a Winchester, far better than the one Itankan had shown him earlier. "This belonged to my husband," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "He died fighting men like the Baxters. He would want it used to protect our family." The weight of that word, family, settled on Boone's shoulders. These people, who he had met only hours ago, had accepted him as one of their own. Now they were preparing to risk their lives for his worthless piece of land. "The cattle," Boone said to Chief Takakota as they mounted their horses, "even if we drive them off, my animals won't survive another week on that land." "Then we bring them back with us," the chief replied simply. "Tonight, your cattle drink from the sacred spring, as part of our herd. As they rode out of the hidden canyon, a column of 20 silent warriors moving like ghosts through the night, Boon felt a strange mix of terror and elation. He was leaving behind the solitary, hopeless life he had known for 3 years. He was riding toward a battle he might not survive, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't riding alone. The journey to his ranch was a hard, fast ride across moonlit terrain. Boon pushed his horse, guiding the Apache warriors through shortcuts and game trails he had learned over years of lonely wandering. He moved with a purpose he had never felt before, surrounded by elite fighters who had placed their trust in him. They crested the final ridge overlooking his property, and the scene below made Boon's blood run cold. It was a vision of hell. His small cabin was a raging inferno, flames leaping into the night sky. His barn was already a collapsed, smoldering ruin. The dry grass of his pasture was on fire, the blaze spreading quickly in the wind. And in the middle of it all, illuminated by the destruction they had wrought, were the Baxter gang. 15 of them. They were laughing, passing a bottle, their rifles leaning against the remains of his corral. They weren't just destroying his property. They were celebrating. They had killed his cattle. The few animals he had fought so hard to keep alive were lying motionless in the field, dark shapes in the firelight. They had been shot for sport. "They want you to see this," Chief Takakota said, his voice a low growl of contained fury. "This is their final offer." One of the men below spotted them on the ridge. A shouted warning cut through the night. The laughter stopped. The gang scrambled for their rifles, taking cover behind the burning corral, forming a defensive line. "What's the plan?" Boon asked, chambering around in the Winchester. His hands were steady. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard anger. Chief Takakota surveyed the terrain with the eyes of a master strategist. "They are fools. They have fire at their backs and open ground in front. They have no cover, no escape." He turned to his men, issuing a series of rapid commands in Apache. Instantly, the warriors split into 3 groups. 10, led by Itankan, would circle wide to the east. 5 would circle to the west. The remaining 5, with the chief and Boon, would create a diversion from the front. "We are not trying to kill them all tonight," the chief explained to Boon, his eyes glinting in the dark. "We want the survivors to carry a message back to their master." "What message?" The chief's lips pulled back in a grim smile. "That the protector of the spring has awoken, and he has allies." The attack was a symphony of brutal precision. As Chief Takakota's small group opened fire from the ridge, drawing the gang's attention, the flanking warriors closed in like specters. Itankan's group emerged from the darkness to the east, their rifles spitting fire. The 5 warriors from the west did the same. Caught in a 3-sided crossfire, the Baxter gang panicked. Their drunken confidence evaporated into terror. The disciplined fire of the Apache warriors was devastating. Men screamed and fell. The firefight was short, chaotic, and completely one-sided. It was over in less than 5 minutes. When the shooting stopped, the silence was broken only by the crackling of the flames and the groans of the wounded. 8 of the raiders were dead or dying. The rest had fled into the night, abandoning their horses, their weapons, and their injured companions. Boon walked through the wreckage of his life. Everything he had built over 3 years was gone, turned to smoke and ash. But as he stood there, surrounded by the quiet, victorious Apache warriors, he felt no sense of loss. He felt reborn. "Your cattle," Nayeli called out, riding up from the pasture. Her face was smudged with soot, but her eyes were bright. 7 survived. They were huddled by the creek bed. 7 animals. A week ago, that would have been a devastating blow. Now, it was a seed, enough to start over. Chief Takakota approached one of the wounded raiders, a young man clutching a shattered leg. "Tell your employer. the chief said, his voice echoing with cold command, that this land and the spring beneath it are now under the protection of the Apache Nation and their partner Boon Carter. Any further trespassing will be an act of war. The wounded man nodded frantically, his eyes wide with terror. And tell him, Boone added, surprised by the authority in his own voice, the days of easy bargains are over. From now on, his offers will be paid in blood. As they gathered the surviving cattle and prepared to leave, Boone took one last look at the ruins. The cabin where he had endured 3 years of lonely hardship. The barn where he had stored his meager hopes. All gone. But as they rode back toward the hidden valley, leading his 7 remaining cattle toward a new home, Boone knew that Chief Takakota's decision hadn't just changed his fate, it had forged it anew in the fires of that night. He was no longer a poor rancher. He was a warrior. He was family. And the war for the Morning Sun Spring had just begun. The Apache Valley looked different when they returned under the first light of dawn. Where Boone had seen a hidden settlement before, he now saw a sanctuary. He now saw home. The lush pastures, the clear flowing water, the warmth of the community, everything his isolated ranch had lacked was here in abundance. His 7 surviving cattle, thin and skittish, moved immediately toward the valley stream. For the first time in months, Boone watched his animals drink their fill of clean water without having to worry about tomorrow. It was a simple act, but it felt like a miracle. They will grow strong here, Ayana observed, joining him by the newly expanded corral where his cattle were being housed. Good grass, clean water, and protection. Protection from predators and from men, Boone added, the reality of the night's events still sinking in. They had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. Chief Takakota approached, carrying the worn leather document case. We must talk, he said, his face serious in the morning light. The fight last night was with hired guns. The next fight will be with lawyers and soldiers, and it will be far more dangerous. They walked to the council fire, where the tribal elders had already gathered. A sense of formal gravity hung in the air. This was the next step. The Baxters will not take this defeat quietly, the chief began, his voice addressing both Boone and the elders. They will ride to the nearest fort. They will claim we are savage raiders who attacked their peaceful surveyors. They will twist the truth until it is unrecognizable, and they will demand the army intervene. He opened the document case and spread the land patents and territorial agreements on a flat stone for all to see. Our legal title is strong, but the authorities often listen to the man with the most money, not the most truth. We need to strengthen our position. How? Boone asked. By making our alliance unbreakable, not just in spirit, but in law, the chief declared. He looked directly at Boone. We want you to become a legal partner in our tribal holdings. Your name on these documents alongside mine. Your ranching operation officially merged with ours. Your residence legally established within the boundaries of the Apache Nation. The offer was staggering. It was an unprecedented level of trust. An elderly man with eyes as sharp as a hawk's leaned forward. It would mean any attack on you, Boon Carter, is a direct legal attack on the property and sovereignty of the Apache Nation. The territorial government would be forced to investigate and prosecute the Baxters, not us. The sheer brilliance of the strategy was profound. It turned Boone from a vulnerable target into a legally protected asset. It wrapped him in the shield of their tribal rights. But there is more, Chief Takakota continued, his gaze intense. We need more than just a partner. We need a voice. Someone who understands the white man's laws and his doublespeak. Someone to represent our interests in their courts and their government offices. We need an advocate. Boone stared at him, speechless. You're offering me a position of authority? We are offering you a future, Ayana said simply, her voice cutting through his disbelief. A purpose, larger than just survival. Before Boone could find the words to respond, the thundering of hoofbeats echoed from the valley entrance once again. The same young scout from the night before rode in, his face pale with alarm. "Chief!" he yelled, dismounting near the council fire. "It is as you feared. A rider from the Baxter compound was seen heading east at dawn, riding for Fort Brennan. He will be there by tomorrow." The timeline had just shrunk from weeks to days. The Baxters weren't wasting a single moment. "They will tell the soldiers that we attacked them without provocation," Itankan snarled, "that we stole cattle and kidnapped a white rancher." The twisted version of events was so audacious it was almost laughable. But Boone knew it was deadly serious. These men had burned his home, killed his animals, and now they were painting themselves as the victims. "How long before soldiers arrive?" Chief Takakota asked the scout. "2 days," the scout replied. "Maybe 3. Depends on how many men the fort commander sends." The chief stood, his expression grim but resolute. "Then we have 2 days to prepare our defense." He turned his full attention to Boone, the eyes of every person in the circle following his. "This is your final choice, Boon Carter. The path ends here. Accept this partnership, sign your name to ours, and face the United States Army with us. Or leave now, before the soldiers arrive, and take your chances alone in the wilderness." Boone looked around the circle of faces, Ayana, Naeli, Itankan, the wise elders, the proud chief. These people had welcomed him, fought for him, and offered him a place in their family. The choice was no choice at all. "I accept," he said, his voice firm and clear. "I will sign, but I want to understand exactly what we're fighting for." Chief Takakota's stern face broke into a proud smile. He gestured to the valley around them, to the children playing, to the horses grazing, to the smoke rising from the homes. "We are fighting for the right to live in peace on the land our ancestors gave us, the land our government legally recognized. We are fighting for the right to defend our families from men who use violence and lies to steal what they want. We are fighting for the principle that justice should protect all people, not just the ones with white skin." The old elder produced a pen and a bottle of ink. "Then let us make it official, before the soldiers arrive." As Boone signed his name to the partnership documents, the ink bleeding into the paper and binding his fate to that of the Apache nation, he felt the immense weight of his decision. 3 days ago, he was a ghost, a failed rancher with no hope. Now, he was a legal partner, a protector, and a family man with a purpose that gave his life a meaning he had never imagined. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Boone knew their greatest challenge was just ahead. The Baxters' lies were fast, and the Army's justice was often blind. "What happens when the soldiers get here?" he asked Chief Takakota. "That depends," the chief replied, his eyes on the horizon, "on whether they come seeking truth or an excuse for a massacre. Either way, we will be ready." Looking at the determined faces in the firelight, Boone believed him. Chief Takakota's decision had changed his fate forever. Now, he would have to prove he was worthy of it. 2 days later, the sound of a bugle echoed off the canyon walls. It was a lonely, sharp sound that announced the arrival of the U.S. Army. Boone stood beside Chief Takakota at the valley's hidden entrance, watching a column of a dozen federal soldiers ride toward them. Leading them was a captain with a weathered face and weary eyes that suggested he'd seen too much of the frontier. "Captain Morrison," Chief Takakota said in greeting as the officer reined in his horse. "It has been some time." "Chief Takakota," the captain replied, his hand resting on his pistol. His gaze swept over the scene, taking in the armed Apache warriors standing watch. "I'm here to investigate serious allegations, reports of unprovoked raids on civilian surveyors, cattle theft, and the abduction of a white rancher named Boon Carter." I'm Boon Carter, Boon said, stepping forward. He was dressed in clean leather clothes the tribe had given him, the Winchester held loosely in his hand. And I haven't been abducted. I've been conducting legal business with my partners. Captain Morrison's eyes narrowed. He scrutinized Boon from head to toe. This clean-clothed, well-fed, and confident man was clearly not the helpless victim he had been sent to rescue. Mr. Baxter's complaint stated you were taken against your will after your ranch was burned to the ground by Apache raiders. Boon let out a short, harsh laugh. Captain, my ranch was burned, that much is true, but it was burned by Baxter's own hired guns after I refused to sell him my land. I have witnesses. He gestured to the warriors around them. Chief Takakota stepped forward, holding the leather document case. Captain, before we discuss Baxter's lies, perhaps you should examine the legal truth. Morrison dismounted and took the case. He opened it and began to read the documents inside. The land patents, the water rights, the territorial agreements. Boon watched the captain's expression shift from stern suspicion to surprise and then to grudging respect. He was looking at legitimate, federally recognized documents. These lands are legally owned by the Apache Nation, the chief explained calmly. And as of 2 days ago, Mr. Carter is a registered partner in our joint ranching operation, with all the legal protections that entails. That may be, Morrison said slowly, handing back the documents. But that doesn't explain the dead men Baxter's riders brought back to my fort. They claim you ambushed them. They were trespassing on my property, Boon countered, his voice hard as steel. They had murdered my livestock and burned my home to the ground. We acted in self-defense. And Captain, we left 3 of their wounded men alive specifically so they could tell you the truth. Morrison's eyes flickered. They told me they were the only survivors of a brutal massacre. Of course they did, Boon said. What else would criminals say? He pulled a folded paper from his vest. This is a list of the men who attacked my property, along with their descriptions. We are prepared to file formal charges against them and their employer, Mr. Baxter, for arson, destruction of property, and attempted murder. One of Morrison's sergeants leaned over and whispered something in his ear. The captain nodded grimly. The men you describe match known associates of the Baxter Cattle Company, Morrison admitted. They have a reputation. Captain, Chief Takakota said, gesturing toward the peaceful valley behind them. You and your men are welcome to inspect our settlement. Count our cattle. You will find no stolen property. You will find only a peaceful, law-abiding community that wishes to be left alone. Morrison considered the offer, then nodded. I'll take you up on that, Chief. For the next 2 hours, the captain and his men conducted a thorough, by-the-book investigation. They saw the thriving community, the healthy livestock, including Boon's 7 cattle, their brands clearly visible and documented, and the detailed records the tribe kept. They interviewed Ayana, Nayeli, and Itankan, all of whom gave consistent, truthful accounts of the events. Finally, Captain Morrison stood before Boon and the chief, his investigation complete. Mr. Carter, he said, I have found your 7 head of cattle, all legally branded and accounted for. He turned to his sergeant. Williams, your findings? Sir, the witness testimonies are all consistent, the sergeant reported. Multiple witnesses confirm Mr. Carter's ranch was attacked by armed men who burned his buildings and killed his livestock. The Apache then provided Mr. Carter with assistance and protection on their legally held land. The captain looked at the peaceful valley, then back at the chief. Chief Takakota, he said formally, based on my investigation, I find no evidence to support the allegations made by Mr. Baxter. In fact, it appears that multiple crimes have been committed against Mr. Carter and your community by Baxter's employees. He turned to Boon. Mr. Carter, I will be filing a full report recommending that the territorial authorities launch a criminal investigation into the Baxter Cattle Company. You will be called to testify. I'll be ready, Boon replied. As the soldiers prepared to leave, Captain Morrison pulled Boone aside. "Son," he said in a low voice, "you know this isn't over. Baxter has money. He has friends in the territorial capital. They'll find another way." Boone looked around at the valley, at the people who were now his family, at the life of purpose he was building. "Captain, 4 days ago I was alone and helpless against men like Baxter. Today I am not." Morrison nodded, a flicker of a smile on his face. "Good for you, son. Just watch your back." As the soldiers rode away, a profound sense of victory settled over the valley. The immediate threat was neutralized. Their partnership was now on official federal record. Baxter's lies had been exposed. But as he watched the dust from the soldiers' horses settle, Boone knew the captain was right. This was just one battle. Baxter was a wounded snake, and a wounded snake is always the most dangerous. The war for the valley and for their future had only just entered a new, more treacherous phase. 3 months later, Boone stood in the territorial courthouse in the county seat. He wore a simple but clean suit, and in his hand he held a briefcase filled with documents that represented the hopes of an entire community. The hearing to officially recognize the Apache Nation's water rights, based on their historic claims and their partnership with his ranching operation, was the culmination of weeks of relentless legal preparation. "Mr. Carter," the territorial judge said, peering down from his bench, "you are here representing the Apache Nation in this matter?" "Yes, Your Honor," Boone replied, his voice steady and confident, as their legally appointed advocate and business partner. The transformation was staggering. Where he had once struggled to keep a dozen cattle alive, he now helped manage a thriving herd that numbered in the hundreds, a joint venture that was becoming a model of prosperity. The morning sun, spring once a secret, was now the legally recognized heart of their operation, providing life not just for their community, but for the entire region. The Apache Valley was no longer a hidden sanctuary. It was a recognized power in the territory. After reviewing the extensive documentation and listening to Boone's carefully prepared arguments, the judge rendered his verdict. This court recognizes the petition of the Apache Nation. Their historical claims, coupled with the legal partnership with Mr. Carter's ranching operations, provide clear justification under territorial statute. Their water rights are hereby confirmed and protected by law. Outside the courthouse, Chief Takakota waited with Ayana and Naeli. The sisters had become his closest confidants, a bridge between his old world and his new one. "It is done," Boone said, a smile spreading across his face. "Complete victory, full water rights, our land boundaries confirmed. We've set a legal precedent that will help protect other tribes." Chief Takakota placed a hand on Boone's shoulder. "You have done well, my son." As they prepared for the journey home, a familiar figure approached. Captain Morrison, now in civilian clothes, walked toward them. "Mr. Carter, Chief Takakota," he said, tipping his hat. "I thought you'd like to know. The investigation into the Baxter Cattle Company concluded yesterday." "And?" Boone asked, his heart pounding. "Federal charges," Morrison said with a grim satisfaction. "Conspiracy, arson, fraud, and attempted theft of territorial lands. Baxter and 3 of his top men are in custody. Their territorial licenses have been revoked. They're finished." Justice. It had been a long, hard fight, but it had been won. "There's more," Morrison continued. "The territorial governor has been following this case. He's impressed. He wants to meet with you both. He wants to talk about establishing a formal council, with you as mediators, to peacefully resolve land disputes involving native communities across the territory." The offer was monumental. It was recognition at the highest level of government. It was an opportunity to turn their personal victory into a lasting peace for everyone. The journey back to the valley took them past the site of Boone's old ranch. Where his cabin had burned, new grass was growing, the land was healing. But as they rode past, Boone felt no sadness. That lonely, desperate life felt like it belonged to another man, in another lifetime. "Do you ever miss it?" Nellie asked gently, following his gaze. "Your independence?" Boone considered the question. "I thought I was independent back then," he said finally. "But I was just alone. Real independence isn't about being by yourself. It's about being strong enough to help others and having people who will help you." As they crested the final ridge, the Apache Valley spread out below them, a thriving jewel in the heart of the desert. He saw his original 7 cattle, now fat and healthy, grazing alongside the tribe's herd. He saw the homes, the families, the life they had all built together. He saw home. "Chief Takakota's decision changed my fate," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "It was the right decision," the chief replied simply. "A man who will risk his life for strangers without thought of reward will fight just as hard to protect his family." Riding down into the valley, welcomed by the smiling faces of his new community, Boon Carter knew the poor rancher he once was gone forever. In his place was a respected leader, a legal advocate, a husband to Ayanna, and a father to their young son. He was a protector of the spring, a builder of bridges, a man who had found his purpose not in solitude, but in kinship. The setting sun painted the valley in hues of gold and crimson, illuminating a future of peace and prosperity, a future he had helped build, a future built on the unshakable truth that he would never again have to face the world alone. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Your support means everything to us.